Want to welcome all of you to this morning's study, the Sunday morning study that we've been doing on the theme of wisdom. And as you can see from this page on the kenboa.org website, if you go to for navigation purposes, because I'd like you to be able to encourage others to be involved, and the way you do that, to go to the home page, and you can just scroll down, touch this button. That's how you sign up. And then if you hover over the weekly studies, this is the first of the 4 weekly studies. They're live Zoom calls, as you know, but then we post-edit them, post-produce them, and we then put them on the website. And here is, for example, the last one we've done. It was the theology of wisdom, and so that was part 18. And if you click on that, I want you to be aware of this. Not only can you see the video, but we always now add these overviews, you see. So this really enhances the thing. So it's a good summary. You could actually read it perhaps before watching the video or after, but it's a simple way of doing that. So we're going to be continuing the theology of wisdom, and then completing our study of the book of Proverbs. And again, it's only a very, very cursory study. But again, we're trying to get a theme that we so much need in our time and in our culture. The theme of wisdom, which seems to have bypassed our times for a lot of reasons. And one of the ones that we noted before is because there is a diminished intergenerational connection. And also there's a diminished appreciation and respect for and learning modality that is associated with the aged, with those who are sages or should be treated as such. So there's a diminishment there because it needs to be transgenerationally imparted. And indeed, the person who taught me wisdom more than anyone else was my own grandmother, because it was an incredible experience that I had with her, actually training me in that realm of wisdom. And in my book, Conformed to His Image, I actually have a photograph of her now, because the newer edition that's just come out has that. And so I'm able to acknowledge her. And so there's a photograph we have of my grandmother that this is a woman who influenced me more than any other person in my whole experience of growing up all the way through college days. And so, remarkable experience that. Well, this is another generation to ahead. So what we see here is that you need to have that wisdom inculcated and developed. So this is why, and I mentioned that then in the Conformed to His Image. And I should also mention once again, I really would love folks at Christ Church and at other churches to now turn this into it's become a curriculum, full-blown curriculum, because all you have to do is watch a 15-minute video, and then as a group, and then you go through the study guide, and the facilitator does that. And the huge textbook doesn't even need to be used if you do not want to. So I'm just calling that to your attention, because it's a powerful thing for us to train and learn together. And that's the whole idea of the impartation of wisdom is so essential. Essentially, what we're looking at when we summarize the motif of wisdom and that literature is that it's not just a matter of living and learning, but also of learning and living. And if we're prudent, we will gain this insight from those who have learned hard-earned lessons in the powerful art of living life with effectiveness, with beauty, so that the raw material of your life, which is therefore precious but still needs to be shaped and formed through discipline, tutelage, training, habituation, understanding, all of that is necessary, so that if we can then have a heart for the subject of wisdom, then we can actually be wise enough to learn and live and not repeat everyone's mistakes every generation. But there'll always be a mutuality between the two, and that's why I have the two arrows, because of course there's going to be a necessity to go through the painful lessons of life, and we well know we learned through our mistakes. The other motif that I see running through this material is always this twofold notion that it is God and not we who are in control of all things. And number two, that He is the one who has our best interests at heart. And though we suppose we know what they look like, we cannot possibly, because we cannot actually see the future. We judge according to appearances, but God knows the outcomes. So we do well then to submit our wills to His, although it's always going to be the constant warfare between the autonomous self, the independent self who does not want to submit to the majesty of the Maker, and rather that we want to have our own fiefdoms, our own will. My name be lifted up, my kingdom come, my will be done. And so that's why the whole motif of the Lord's Prayer is inimical to that and moves us from what I would call an egocentric worldview to a Christocentric or theocentric worldview, in which the center now is not us, but rather we are seeing that it's Christ in us, the hope of glory, and that's what really defines us. So as we continue to look at these themes, and I'll just pick up from where we left off, because I want to, we were this material again, just to let you know, because some people have asked, again, what is this document you're using? And it says Part 7. And this was a 7-part teaching series I did. One of some others, I've actually done longer ones on Proverbs than that. But I chose this one because the transcription I discovered to be a useful way of kind of presenting this and giving you the opportunity to see it with me. I thought really would help. And I think a lot of people like the visual edition. And so with that then, I'm going to be, I've been editing it, and once I'm through with this little component in this or the next session, we'll then have it edited further and then add it to the website. So you don't need to worry about any of these images. We're going to make that available to you. But in this last session, in terms of this sequence on Proverbs, tying the threads together concerning wisdom as a theological understanding is, as we've seen last time, just a quick summary, that it's God's plan to transform a dead chaos into a living cosmos in which He created and shaped and populated the world. And by the same way, He created us, and now He shapes us and actually transforms chaos into beauty. And it is our life then that is chaotic at first, but needs to be turned into something that is skillful and beautiful, that is something that benefits other people. And there's a brief sojourn in a fallen world, but the exquisite design that we can see that surrounds us, even in the fallen world, we explored that. And I'm tempted to go there, but I love the beauty and the elegance of the natural world, because it goes back to God's gratuitous beauty. It's called non-adaptive coding, and non-adaptive coding, or non-adaptive order, to use Michael Denton's term, the biologist. Non-adaptive order is beauty and order and design, evidence of design that's not required for or necessary for or even related to adaptation for survival. And there's no way that Darwinianism can even begin to account for it. It's gratuitous beauty, and so much of life as we see it is actually of this nature, non-adaptive order. So He, even in a fallen world then, He creates beauty and glory, and we can immerse ourselves in it. The more we learn, the more astonishing it becomes on the macrocosm, on the macro level, on the microcosm, and which is all the orders of magnitude, down to the 10 to the 35th meter, which is the Planck limit. And also the midicosm, the biosphere, that 14-mile thick, 7 up, 7 down, thin band of life, rich and reticulated with beauty and glory and wonder, the more we have the eyes to see. Again, the poem I always now has been coming to mind is that of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, when she says, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries." You and I need to see the fire of God in everything in the created order. But we can also see that fire of God in the person that we meet, because that person is a bearer of the image of God, and though fallen, has great dignity great authority. And if a person is actually also a possessor of not just the biological life, bios, but also of the second life, the second birth of Zoe, the life of Christ in him, then this person becomes a person of great dignity and glory indeed, because he's being prepared in this earthbound sojourn for his eternal citizenship, his eternal residence, his eternal creative endeavors in the kingdom of God and God's household. And so that in the Father's house then, especially in the new creation, we will then be with him, and we will be able to do things we can hardly even begin to imagine. So this is part of a beautiful narrative that shows us that this earthbound difficulty, that the pains and sorrows and sufferings of life are designed to prepare us for the glory of home. And so we see then his desire for us is that we surrender and submit and actually come to know him, not just intellectually, but relationally. And then we discover then that it's always pointing to us to him and not merely to ourselves, to his character, to his attributes, and to his perfections. That he is the transcendent and unchangeable, immutable wellspring, the fountainhead of all the transcendentals of that which is true, good, and beautiful. And so we see then, when God is being true, when God is being beautiful, when God is being loving, he's being himself. And so the concept then is coming to have an intimate experience so that we come to know him. And once we find him, then we discover all the goods are thrown in, including wisdom as to how to allow that vertical relationship with Christ Jesus then empower us on the horizontal relationships that we have in our spheres of relationships with others, at our sphere at work. Wisdom as well about practical matters of money and about character, about how we speak and how we listen. These are all arenas of wisdom, but the wellspring, the fountainhead, is always God. We also looked in our last time at James, because we saw that there is the works-oriented source of wisdom is anthropocentric, as we said earlier. It's from below. It's human-centered. And when we were looking at the book of James, I used this little contrast as well between the two kinds of, not this one, but the two kinds of understanding about the wisdom from above and the wisdom from below, which I just had here, and I can't seem to find him. Here we go. The wisdom from above is peaceable and of good fruits, but there is a distorted wisdom that imitates but distorts and counterfeits the wisdom from above and becomes shrewd and slick and slippery. And you're not so sure about this, you see. So it presents a false pose. And so this does not lead to life, but it leads to death, not to vitality, not to hope, not to purpose. And so we see then that what we really want is the idea of peaceable, gentle, fruitful works of wisdom sown in righteousness by those who make peace. We also explored the idea that God is reaching down and closing the gap. Its wisdom is that comes from above. We could not ever attain it. He's the one who woos and pursues and seeks us. And so the concept then that he would actually take on human flesh and in that love relationship pursue us even to his own death, is the one then who gives in his death life to us, because his death is the death of death. And ultimately then he becomes what he was not, so that we become what we were not, the perfect man then. And so he's what the vision of what true beauty and goodness and wisdom and truth and understanding and love, he was the incarnation of that. He puts a face to all these realities. Jesus puts a face on infinity and on eternity. And so we see then that we're being gradually conformed to his image, and that is a purpose and a process that God has invited us to pursue. He wants us, therefore, to be people who could become more and more conformed to the image of his Son, so that, as we say, no one attains sinless perfection. No, we're on a journey, we're in a process of becoming conformed to his image. Now, I must again stress, though, there is that in you which already is perfect, and that is your spirit. And so you are seated with him in your spirit in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. And that's that part of you, that deepest self, which is already declared righteous and does not need to improve. That does not need to change in the future. But what does need to be changed, and what is actually being shaped right now, and often through suffering, is our soul, our mind, our will, our emotions, our imaginations, our desires, our aspirations, and so forth. And our bodies, which are wearing out, nevertheless, ultimately, even those will be resurrected. And the soul then will be is being transformed from glory to glory, so that in our soulish self, we are already, we are becomers. We're not yet where we need to be, and that's why we say and think and do things we don't want to say, think, and do. But now we have the option that we're no longer under the power of the flesh, but rather the pull of sin no longer needs to dominate us, because we are now not only free from the penalty of sin, when Christ died for us, but we're now being set free from the power of sin. So it's a very intriguing idea here. And in our very life, in our very presence, he's setting us free then from all of these dimensions then. And his desire for us is to see what life is truly meant to be about. And so we see then that God has given us a great gift and a great glory, a great good in our own lives. Let me illustrate this, what I was mentioning just before, so that he's redeemed us from the penalty of sin in the past, but now from the power of sin in the present. Sin no longer has to have dominion over us. And ultimately then in the future, ultimate sanctification, that our position and our practice will be one and the same, and the two will be put together. And the basis of our positional sanctification is the work of Christ. That's nothing we could have done. That's Ephesians 1-3, that's Romans 1-8, that's Colossians 1-2. That's all our position in him. But then in the present tense, now we actually are called to live out what he's already given to us. And that's based upon our identification with him, our crucifixion. So identification with Christ is the basis for our imitation of Christ. And so then in the future then, we are no longer going to be becomers, but that we will actually be fully immersed then in his presence, separate from the presence of sin, but it will not be something that's static. As I like to describe heaven, endless creative activity without frustration to the glory of God. And so I can see that there will be further up and higher in, we'll constantly be learning and growing and moving in that direction. So God's desire for us then is to become more and more conformed to God's expectations, his desires, his purposes. God has expectations, desires, and purposes for our lives. And we need, though, to be participants and not merely passive. He's called us to agency, and we as causal agents are therefore people who've been given the freedom, the capacity then to respond to God's desire and God's vision. And that's really what wisdom's about, cultivating a higher call, a higher sense of how do we define the good life. And the good life is much more than just the kinds of things that most people give themselves in exchange for: position, power, popularity, possessions. Those kinds of things will never sustain or satisfy us. Otherwise, we'll settle for things lower than what God has in mind. And there is the dimension here. Don't settle for that, because you see, we will suffer, but ultimately we will discover that once we allow him to have his way in our lives and submit and surrender to them, then we discover what life is going to be about. Not an easy way, no guarantee about that, but that it is the way that you would choose no other way, because I've never regretted an act of obedience, and neither have you. So God then would allow you. But imagine then he had, okay, just have everything your way, anything you want, when you want them, and how you want them. You'd be ruined. Just think about that. You'd be full of arrogance. You'd be autonomous. God's a cosmic vending machine. And so then he's obligated, and you become so independent. And who needs God? So you actually wouldn't even be thinking about him. So the reality is you don't really grow from your successes. You grow far more from your failures, your setbacks. And so the qualities we most admire in people then turn out to be qualities not of arrogance and power, but rather of humility, of other-centeredness, of courage, of perseverance, of patience, these qualities that we admire because that's the fruit of the Spirit. And so we see then this, as in that song, thank God for unanswered prayers, because there's a whole lot of mine that I'm glad he didn't answer when I wanted to. I'd be ruined if he basically was like a cosmic bellhop. So recognize then you are called to come to the wisdom of submission to his purposes and growing in understanding that his desires for you are always better than what you would have chosen for yourself. Even every day I'm now discovering that when I catch myself, my plans, I had a certain sequence of things I hoped I was going to do today, and I'm getting behind my schedule. And immediately then you realize there's a little mini surrender that needs to be taking place, because you can't control. You can plan your day, but it's never going to be the way you might have wanted. And so in those moments, I'm trying to train myself more and more to catch myself. Why are you anxious? Why are you in a hurry? Slow down. Be with God, because he's allowed that to happen. And he's also then one who calls you to the kairos moments, not just to the chronos moments. And so when we let loose of controlling chronos, time, our calendar, and understand that the Holy Spirit also calls us to kairos, to opportunities, unexpected, so-called interruptions, which are really invitations, and he has other things in mind. So I'm now seeking to train myself, and I would encourage you to try the same, of anytime you catch yourself in a hurry, pause for a moment and realize it's because you've now made your joy dependent upon your own idea of what you should do that day. In other words, it's really then your own ideas that are just artificially imposed rather than what is really happening. So in those mid-course corrections, it's like a mini surrender. It's like a little I die daily moment. It's like a mini kenosis, as it were. It's this interesting thought that in a very real way, just as Christ laid down all his rights and privileges to become a human and took humanity into himself with undiminished deity, there is an emptying that took place. In a very similar way, I think we all need to have a voluntary, personal kenosis. And that's, I think, the emptying and the letting loose and the allowing God then to choose to be dominant, to reign, to rule, because his service is our perfect freedom. We don't find freedom on our own terms. We suppose we do, but our freedom leads to a slavery, to some arbitrary definition of what our best interests look like, rather than allowing ourselves to constantly be recalibrated and intentionally recalibrate by that kenotic diminishment where we say, not my will, but yours be done. You are the Lord. Let it be done to me according to my master. So this idea then is the idea of a lover, but also one who submits and serves, because what this person knows that it's only our submission to him that truly sets us free. So this is really when we understand he lifts us beyond our expectations. He will take us beyond what we would have planned for ourselves. Look back, and if we realize those acts of obedience are intentional, there is a telos, there's a direction for them. A far better destiny, I believe, than I had in mind. I still remember what I dreamed of and imagined in high school. And it seemed good to me at the time, but I'm pretty glad I didn't do those things. I had these ideas of what that I'd become a high school teacher and teaching in science. I remember teaching physics in my mind's eye. And it was a very, very strange idea, wearing this white shirt with a short sleeve shirt with a pocket protector. And then the whole thing of all that other time, almost like a slide rule on my belt. Pretty nerdy. But I thought that would be a cool thing to do at the time. But I'm pretty glad that's not really what I was destined for. But at any rate, his desire is for us to see, I've got something better than you could have imagined, because I see something you cannot possibly see. So this whole idea then being brought into the understanding of transgenerational wisdom, as I mentioned a bit earlier, through the teaching and example of parents, and I would add grandparents, as in my life and in many of yours as well. The whole idea of the sages, that provide these maxims, pithy overviews. They're basically simply wrought fundamental observations on life itself, basic principles of what's life. What is life intended to be like? Even though fallen, there's still a way in which we can order our steps to be pleasing to the Maker, who is going to make all things new. But even in this fallen world, he can make something beautiful out of that raw material because it's his image. We are his image bearers. And when we can see what that looks like, it's utterly astonishing. The concept of being image bearers, I'm inclined to find something for you here. The idea of the image of God. I've got one of the books I'm working on is Imago Dei, the 18 Facets of the Image of God in You. And when you look at these images, you see that we are spiritual beings. Because God is spirit, we have a God consciousness. We can commune and communicate with God. We have a spirit. And so the animals do not. We have a spirit. We are relational beings because God is the ultimate foundation and basis for relationships. The I and the thou, and the one and the many. The lover and the beloved, the love that flows between them. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Perfect communion, communication, other-centeredness, service, and so forth. And then if I take the next three in their order, truth, goodness, and beauty, which are those transcendentals then we can see that we're rational beings, we're moral beings, and we're aesthetic beings, you see. That we actually have these capacities because they correspond to the transcendentals for which we were made, so that God has called us then. We're also other aspirations, other aspects rather, like aspirational, receptive, giving, and so forth. We're amazing. And then we're going to be just teasing it out. What does that image look like? And what is the meaning? What does it look like in the Bible? How was it distorted and broken? Whether take any one of these. So if I say nurturing beings or imaginative beings, how was that distorted? And then how is it being redeemed now already in our relationship with God, ourselves, and others? And what will that future image look like? So it's a rather fun idea to do that. But my point is simply this, that we must see ourselves as God sees us then, as people who are meant for more than this world can provide, and that because we are really amphibious beings with one foot in heaven, the other on earth, that we are spiritual beings in this earth-bounded arena. So we discover, though, that the contents, once we get past chapter 9, we have to arrange them topically, because recall that the first 9 chapters were designed. We have 10 hortatory injunctions of the Father to the Son. If you will learn to treasure wisdom, here's what you will gain from it, and here's what you will avoid by wisdom. Wisdom will not only protect you, but it'll also empower you to live a life of meaning and purpose and truth. And so 9 chapters before we even hit the Proverbs themselves. But the rest, then after that, they are sequenced mnemonically more in the Hebrew Bible than by topic. But you better layer them and precept upon precept and revisit them on a regular basis. And so when we see the Proverbs then, we discover that they focus on details that are very specific, that actually aren't discussed in Torah, and various specific things, or even by the prophets. They're broader social concerns and so forth, and some personal things. But when this gets down to how you speak, how you listen, how you basically transact business, how you handle your wealth, how you relate to your neighbor, now we're getting very specific indeed. And so we're looking at then is areas of character, as I just mentioned, speech, what is domestic life looking like? What are the parameters in that? How do I treat my neighbors, my friends, my wealth? Because if we do this, then we discover that there are various apprenticeships. In fact, I've come to see life as a multiplicity of apprenticeships, where you are first an apprentice, and then you become a journeyman, and you become more and more skilled, so that the master doesn't have to constantly overlook and check your work, but from time to time will. And then ultimately the intention is that you become a master yourself who then takes your own apprentices and brings them through the process, journeymen and masters, so that it's a transgenerational result. And when you think about glass blowers, or if you think about Cartwrights, these last names that we get, in fact, Thatchers, and Smith, of course, is the biggest one because there's many kinds of Smiths. What we see is a name that's based upon the skill that was conveyed from generation to generation. In so many cases, though, a lot of these skills of how to make the Stradivarius or Guarneri, this instrument, have been lost, but because they were secrets, trade secrets, even things about stained glass windows and the color red and so forth. There are many of those secrets that are now appear to be lost because they need to be conveyed and inculcated. In a very real way, we're disciples of Christ, and our job then is discipleship must be seen then as apprenticeship in the life of Christ and kingdom living, as Dallas Willard well put it. And the concept then in the divine conspiracy especially, to be an apprentice then of the master, and to realize that we then carry it on generation to generation, an unbroken succession right down to the present day. So that is a good way for us to envision our lives as lives of wisdom, where we carry them forth. And one of the themes that and there are forms of wisdom, and you'll learn different kinds. So that's why some person can have wisdom with wealth and be very foolish in relationships, or vice versa. So there are multiple apprenticeships that take place in life, I think. There's a universal purpose, and part of our whole purpose is to discover what is God's purpose and his overall purpose, especially in light of the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. In the Great Commandment, we see then his purpose for us, of course, is to be lovers of God and others, and the Great Commission is really the effective way in which we express that. And so in our spheres of influence, and as I see it then, it involves evangelism and discipleship in our sphere of influence, without being confrontational, but by building relationships, by becoming winsome, and by pointing them to the life of Christ. So I think of the Great Commandment, loving the Lord your God and your neighbor, as a bow, and the Great Commission as the arrow that gets focused intention, because if I love my neighbor as myself, I'm going to seek my neighbor's highest good. And what is their highest good? If they don't know Christ, it's to come to know him, and that's evangelism. If they do know Christ, it's to become more like him, and that's edification. And so those are the two things, E squared, that are part of our universal purpose. But God's beautifully crafted and wired you so that you're called to have unique purposes as well. This just reminds me of something that I spontaneously think I should show to you, because it's kind of an interesting study that I did, so I'll show it to you here. These are dahlias in our garden, and this particular variety of dahlia intrigued me because no two are identical. You see how that's different. This is not the same as that, and it's the same variety of dahlia. Another difference, very different in this one, but the same variety. Yet another one. Look at how radically different this is. The same, not just species, but the same variety of dahlia, and yet look at how radically different they are. And here's another one. Again, look at the different colors, the different patterns. What is it? Look at this more purpley, and this again with these hues. What is this telling us? And you see that this is telling us, it's a metaphor, I think, in the natural world that points us to something more very profound in the spiritual world, and it's this. I believe that God has crafted us just like each of those flowers will be unique. No two will ever be alike. And yet there's the same they participate in that same community. In fact, if you look at the structure that's involved in creating these plants, and you look at all the almost woody components, they get so huge. And those things which do not seem to be most seemly or inviting, actually, when looked at more closely, are quite beautiful. And then the flowers themselves, so it's like the body of Christ in that imagery here. But the concept here is that each of us has been created and crafted by God from the eternities to accomplish a specific and a unique purpose, to reflect and to refract the glory of the light of Christ in us and through us, as us, through the unique prism of our personality, so that no two people, even in the heavenly realm then, will do that in an identical way, so that the communion of the saints will be vast and the permutations boundless, infinite. So the combinations. So I love the idea of the exquisite variety, and you can do this, and I've been doing that study with a lot of our plants of late, just kind of reflecting on that. So we have unique purposes as well that I think it's good for us to consider. Having spoken about God's purpose for your life, then there are some absolutes to keep, positive and negative, but then there are some things that really have to do with boundaries. And when there's a clear, and the boundaries can, if I go too far, I'm going to violate. Now, what's the edge? We have to be careful. Don't go to the edge of those boundaries, because there are some people who want to go close to the edge of the boundary lines as possible, and that becomes a very unwise endeavor. Let me give you a metaphor or an analogy of that. I was just thinking about this. When I've been to Stone Mountain in Georgia, about 900 feet tall, solid granite, huge. It's intriguing to look at this structure, because as you see, it kind of has a sloping effect that can be deceptive. Right here, it's obvious but when you're up here, it's not so obvious. So if we were to consider then the idea of taking a look at this, so this area up here would seem to be more or less flat, but you could go down to here, but there would be some point, and you can't see it, right in front of you, where you would have taken one step too far, and having done that, you will then plummet to your death. And so it's intriguing how that becomes a metaphor for me. Another way of seeing it is this. So as you can see from this vantage point, there's some areas where you can be safe, but others, as you can see, there are fences even. Don't cross the fence. And I can cross the fence. Look, I'm perfectly fine. Even if there wasn't water, there's no water, and frankly, I'm perfectly fine. And then you can go just one step too far, and that's why the boundaries are there. So ask the question, there's some people who push the boundaries, got away with that, then they're kind of playing with sin. And they're kind of giving it an option, and that's the danger when you begin to consider it as disobedience as an option. There's a dangerous move that takes place. You sit on the fence, and then you put your right foot over it, then your left foot, and sooner than you know it, you're over. And you really haven't fallen off the mountain, but you see, you're now no longer having the boundaries, the margins, so that you've put yourself in a vulnerable position. Let me illustrate what I do myself with this, because I know my own nature, and I have my own flesh. Everyone has a flesh pattern. And my flesh pattern, and I reveal it and conform to his image, I have a temptation to anger. I have a temptation to seek revenge. Third, I have a temptation for sexual temptation, vulnerable to that. And fourth, to coveting. So these are the 4 areas that I've identified as my flesh pattern. It doesn't mean that nothing else touches me, but these are particularly important areas that I need to be aware of. And that's why I came up with a boundary and a certain margin for myself in each of these areas. For example, with sexual temptation, the wise thing would be not to put yourself in a position of compromise, of vulnerability in what I see, what I read, what I hear. So I have to be very cautious about that. And also because I'm aware of these, I need to be able to leverage the temptation for my own gain. That's why I came up with the word gratitude, to overcome the anger, because just my anger is typically related to blocked goals. And so if something happens and then I get angry because my goal, but if I instead realize I've been grateful, let's say a tire blew out, I'm grateful that I have a car and that I have the freedom to drive it and so forth. In other words, choose the way of gratitude, because I can't be angry and grateful at the same time. Choose the way of grace rather than revenge. And again, that simple word, when I'm tempted to be basically a road vigilante, it's a very serious mistake. Give them grace. Be my guest. Sexual temptation, the glory of God in this person. And it reveals then that this is an image bearer, not an object to be used, but a subject to be served. And then coveting can be transformed by goodness. Instead of thinking about what I lack, consider the goodness of the God who's given you all things that you need. And so this becomes a valuable thing. So going back to this idea of boundaries, then, don't live on, those are boundaries that you need to mark, to protect yourself so that you will not go over. It's like a hedge then, a buffer zone, if you will. And so in this concept then of having that margin of a buffer zone, we can see then that hedge, they're not commandments, these convictions. So if you have a conviction and another does not share it, you can respect that, but don't impose your convictions on others if it's not something commanded or condemned in Scripture. So I think of a conviction as a fundamental behavior that we resolve between a kind of a practice that we resolve between ourselves and God. They're not absolutes. And I have to recognize also, I have to see, I don't want them to become static, or I'll just do it because that's the way I've always done it. So you have to be revisited as well. But those are convictions and flesh patterns. We have just a couple more minutes here, and then we'll open it up for questions. I know that the class will be at Christ Church will be over at 10:15, but then I'll stay on after that for those who want to have a Q&A session with me. So I'm suggesting here that some people may need a bigger buffer, let's say, for example, in sexual temptation. And what would be a good conviction? One good conviction with sexual temptation is this, and I apply this. This is a conviction. I don't make it a command. It's not. But whenever I travel, and I happen to be alone, very rarely am I alone because I always have traveling companions. But even there, if I have my own motel room or hotel room and they have their own, I choose never to watch television. Never turn it on. Because I never know what's going to happen. Guys are like grazers, and then they become gazers. You see, they're almost grazing, and the flesh is looking for some material to amplify, and then it catches it, and we deceive ourselves. But we begin to waste our time, if at best, and actually distort our minds, and so that rather than even watching it, I've never regretted not watching television. Stop and think about it, and you'll agree. Especially when I'm by myself. I know that I have in the past, so therefore don't allow that to become a cause of stumbling. So that's a conviction that I have. It's basically a thought out resolution between me and God that governs my behavior. I cannot impose it on another person, but it provides a hedge so that I am protected without having to be wasting my time with that kind of a thing. So this is what I mean. It might be financial areas. You can get the idea. Buffer zone. So this is what I'm suggesting here, is the wisdom of margin. And that's always something necessary. Convictions that are resolved. Now, one conviction might be how much time you spend in the Scriptures, because it's intriguing that the New Testament does not tell us how often to pray and when to pray and what to pray. The Lord's Prayer is an exemplar, but again, it doesn't say, here's how often you do it and so forth. That's why I'm a very big believer, though, in encouraging people to pray Scripture back to God. But it's a conviction for Daniel that, and he prayed 3 times a day. And it was not something in Torah that suggested that. But when you have convictions, they'll be tested.
Hannah, Sally, I have a question.
Yes.
Too. I know you showed the picture of the dahlia, and you said there was an image of Christ in it. That's also with the dogwood and the sand.
Oh yes, indeed. Those. There's a lot of things. Like you're right, Sally. There's a lot of things in those that I think are more than just suggestions. There's some pretty obvious things, but they give us analogies, don't they? And so we see the cruciform pattern and the idea of the. First of all, you have the dogwood and that pattern, then the red at the tips and so forth. There's a lot of imagery there that can certainly be related to it. But that beauty, that glory, that design. But what I never had noticed that when I was doing the Dahlia study, as I said before, how incredible those things are in terms of the variety that you see, because if you look at them in this manner here, let me just go out here, you can see the study, how incredible they are. So that this variety that we had, all within the same kind. So I love it. So this might be one believer, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. They're all the same, and yet they're not. They are treasured, unique, beautiful, unique, one-off, never be another. I love that idea. So you're quite right about those, the sand dollar as well, and lots of other things that can be seen.
And we're not seeing any of those.
Oh my gosh, I'm making a mistake. I've got to get back in that habit. I sometimes forget to look at the monitor. I'm looking at my iPad and then forgetting you're not seeing it. This is what I was. Tell me the next time right away. I'm totally wasting your time. But just look at how, again, this is one believer and here's another, and they'll never be the same. They'll be unique. Each one is unique, reflecting, refracting the glory of God. And you see this extraordinary pattern that's involved here. That in fact, I had this little thing here. I was looking at a video, and this the carpal, which has been very interesting to me, especially in zinnias, and then the stamens there, and so you have this area around that's around here, in that center, and then you have the sepals and then the petals. And look at the patterns that you see. And this is, again, this is non-adaptive order. This doesn't have anything to do with adaptation. Here's some dahlias that that are growing up on our telephone pole here. Not telephone pole, a light. Incredible to watch. So, and then these clematis on the wall. I took this yesterday. And then these kind of faux orchids that are exquisite in their own right as well. And then the camellias as well. So just all this glory and blossom and bloom and beauty. And God is telling us something. If we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, we do well to listen and look. What other questions might we have here? I just reflowed my library with my associate Pete Bodie, and it's about 10,000 volumes. And I now have them all in sequence. And fun thing, I just showed some friends. My friend Hayes Wilson, I think, was with me, and he's on this call. Didn't I show you, Hayes, the kind of a logical order of my library? Am I right? And I kind of took you through from the beginning to the end. And I was... Absolutely. Yeah, and wasn't that fun though? Because it's really a way, how does a person encompass the corpus of human knowledge? And so it was great because it allowed me also to pull out a bunch of books I want to teach in my podcast, which we're going to be starting up now. I'm going to start developing an inventory, one-off things. So, but it's been said that it's the people you meet and the books that you read are the most important thing in your life. The people you meet and the books that you read, especially if these are great books. This is why I strongly encourage people. I even did 4 volumes on a taste of the classics and the great books. When Chuck Colson invited me a number of years ago now to teach a great book once a month that they'd put on Breakpoint, which they did for 4 years. I still look back, I don't know how I did that, because most of those I had not read when I was in high school or college. I was a doofus, and I just kind of chose not to read stuff until, so actually I read them at a time in my life which was actually better than it would have been. I wasn't ready for them when I was a teenager, a little more maturity, and you see a great book like War and Peace, or the Brothers Karamazov, or Anna Karenina, or Milton's Paradise Lost, or Dante's Divine Comedy, and Les Miserables. I hadn't read several of these. Now, some of them I had, but so I had to synthesize that. But let me just say then, this great literature is great for a reason, and a story well told will always point beyond itself to the greatest story ever told. And the greatest story ever told, of course, is the good news of the gospel, the great story where I describe it as having these 4 acts. And that is the greatest story. But when I teach a film, when I teach a poem, when I teach anything in the realm of science or other areas, no matter what it is. If it's well done, if the story, the poem, the play, the novel is well crafted, if the film is done beautifully, if the architecture is, it points beyond itself to the greatness of the greatest story ever told, and that in which we now participate because we're part of a story that began well and will end well, which I love. Any other thoughts on? So I'm enjoying. You can see I didn't get through the last part of the Proverbs thing. I have another session to go, but that's okay. It's good to do this.
Dallas Road?
Dallas Willard, yeah, Dallas Willard, Willard. He influenced me in a couple of books, especially this first book I read by him, I think, was The Spirit of the Disciplines, and it was kind of connected with Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline, and the two of them kind of were associated together with Renovare, and I was actually involved in Renovare and did some teaching for them for a period of time as well. But Foster and Willard then were very much into this whole notion of the spiritual disciplines and using them as vehicles for training for habituation. And one of the themes that I found to be so valuable in his work was the idea that it's not effort that's opposed to grace, it is earning. That really helped me a lot, this concept here. I picked that up from Dallas Willard. It's not effort, it's earning that's opposed to grace, because while salvation is a gift of God, reward in the kingdom of heaven is based on faithfulness to opportunity, and we then discover that effort is involved, because as Augustine put it, without God we cannot. Without us, he will not. And that's an important profundity that we need to see that relates to this concept. Let me see, this other one that helped me a lot was the trying versus the training, and see if I can find it here. Yes, it's this idea, not trying, but training. And this was for me a breakthrough, realizing it's not a matter of hard work in one sense. Instead, the hard work is on my own power, but rather training in righteousness in his power. So that practice, habituation, training, the formation of long-term habits by a long obedience in the same direction, by a steadiness, you see. And then it's not a matter of time and intention. The breakthrough there was that as amphibious beings, we can think on two levels simultaneously, so that I can train myself to see the visible and as well, not the invisible, and more clearly, so that the not yet and the not seen, which is what really faith is, the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We, I believe, as spiritual beings can train ourselves. It's not our natural modality in this world, but we can train ourselves to become so attuned to the reality of the spiritual dynamics that after a while through training, then we can begin to practice as present more and more frequently. And that's why I talk about this in terms of the neuroplasticity that's involved in creating new neural pathways that become thicker and thicker with the melanin myelin sheaths rather, and that they get thicker like pathways. It's astonishing. There's a physiological basis for this training dimension, which means that as you train yourself in righteousness, as you habituate, then it gives you freedom. It's so that training is not a question of the loss of freedom to me, but it's rather the gaining of freedom. It's like the Toodles, the train. There's a little story, the kid story, and about the train who wanted to go off the track because he thought he could do better than, why am I limited to this track? And eventually he does get off of the track, and the sad part is he gets all mired in mud after a while. At first it's fine, but then he gets mired down, and the crane has to pull him back, put him on the track, and then he learns the freedom of the rails. So that the point is that training and habituation and discipline is not something that limits your freedom, but actually empowers it. So that when a person trains and pays the price tag of gaining skill in the art of playing an instrument, let's say a piano or a violin, they have a freedom I do not have. But they paid a price for that freedom. And so in a very real way, apprenticeship and kingdom living, you pay a price for it, but it's always worth, because it enhances your freedom. Does that make sense? I hope it does.
Ben, this is Mike from Knoxville.
Yes.
I want to thank you for distributing on Thursday of this week a video by a gentleman by the name of Tom Klingenstein, Chairman.
Yes, that was an important video. Very important video.
Yes, I think that's an important video. I hope it gets a lot of use.
I do too.
Distributing that.
I'm pleased about that because that's something that yes, it's very clear. It's would appear to be one-sided, but it's not so much. It's contextualizing this thing in terms of two worldviews, and it's bigger than an individual. So it's something at least people need to hear another point of view. Yeah, yeah. I'm glad that you've joined our study, Mike.
Well, yeah, I'm not dressing up. I'm just showing up.
Yeah, I always tell people, don't stand up. I don't know what you're wearing. I've seen that happen. There are videos about people doing that, and they forgot that their camera's still on. Oh my, yeah. This is good. Any last thoughts we have before we? So this to me was this experience. By the way, this was a breakthrough. The idea I don't have to spend extra time to pray for a person while I'm talking with them. I can train myself to do it and be aware of the spiritual and the visible material simultaneously, because I'm an amphibious being, and that to me that was an important moment. It doesn't take extra time to practice His presence. Instead, you actually are inviting Him to be immersing yourself in Him, even as you're doing something mundane. Even if you're, say, loading the dishwasher or making a salad, you can be still doing that. So the old secret that Brother Lawrence talked about is really quite attainable, and it's not a question of just more advanced people. It's just a question of training yourself so that you begin to love God in all the activities that you do. There's no sacred secular dichotomy. That's a false idea. Everything becomes spiritual when the focus of your heart's the eternal. So that the most routine, ordinary, even things that I don't like to do, I can love Him even when I'm doing things I don't like to do, like paying taxes and bills and things like this. I don't like to do it, but I can love Him and in it, because then He's called me to do this at this time. Let's do it well. Let's do it with integrity. Let's do it with skill. Let's do it with excellence. Let's do it as unto the Lord. And then what happens is you bring a higher dimension, and that reaches down and takes the ordinary, and it's called splendor in the ordinary. Even then, there's no little people, no little places, no little things, but everything matters in terms of the economy of the kingdom of God.